Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. My name is Braden Knudsen. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. I'll be your host for this webinar. As we get started going through our announcements, we'd like to invite you to participate in the polls that we have down at the bottom of the screen. We always love to hear from you and help us keep this webinar program going. So our next webinar after today will be tomorrow, Friday, October 13th. At 4:30 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. And that webinar is titled The Digital Race for Genealogy Books The Digital Race for Genealogy Books and Records, not just books, books and records. And James will be back again for us for that webinar as well. So today we'll be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled New Rules Added to the Old, The Rules of Genealogy Revisited. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law from Arizona State University. He worked for 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 35 years experience in genealogical research and is a blogger for Genealogy Star and the blog Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He is a co-author or author of over 25 books on genealogical research and has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren. And as we get this all set up, we'd like to remind you that we do have a questions box on the right-hand side of the screen. Feel free to write in with any questions during the presentation, and we'll make sure they're answered by the end.
Howdy, this is James Tanner. I'm here for another BYU Family History Library webinar. We'd like to remind everyone that these webinars are recorded and uploaded to our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel on youtube.com from Google. And we'd encourage you to subscribe because it helps us get a little bit of notice above the background of dogs and cats and etc., things that are on YouTube. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the new rules added to the old, the rules of genealogy revisited. Now, hopefully some of you are aware of these rules, but I've decided to take the format of the top 10, and I would put these into the top 10 rules for genealogy. And it reminds me of the old days when when you get as old as I am, you can say the old days and mean old days. When you had the hit parade and the top 10 music countdown every once in a while on the radio and that kind of thing, a lot of promotions in the top 10. If you ever want to do something that's interesting, just look at the top 10 of anything on the, on Google, on a Google search. You'll find out that just about everything in the world has been ranked in the top 10 of something. So it's kind of a big deal, and I thought it was a good way to introduce this. So we're going to start with number 10 and work our way down to number 1, as they used to say on the radio, except I don't have all the sound effects and everything that they have in those old radio studios. Okay, so let's get started here with number 10. So we're going to count down now on the rules of genealogy. Now, why do we need rules for genealogy? Well, I guess I don't know why we do, but guess we do need rules because there are so many instances of people who do things that basically are kind of outside of these particular rules. And so I'm going to just point out some of the foibles and the difficulties and the things that happen that I see very, very regularly. And most of these rules came about as a result of teaching classes or helping people one-on-one get into their genealogy and begin to understand how all of this works. So here we go with number 10. Number 10 is kind of interesting given the sign that I put here on the screen, that fine print ahead. And number 10 rule is read the fine print. One of the things that you learn in being a lawyer is to read. They say read the fine print. Well, eventually, what I got to the point where I just thought, well, I'm not going to read all of this stuff. I know exactly what it's supposed to say. Well, that's kind of a trap, folks. You can get to the point where you say, I don't really need to look at the details. And the fine print that I'm mentioning here is to study and use all the information in the documents you discover. Okay, so this is how it applies to genealogy. So what I find frequently is that people are going out and adding a source, for example, to FamilySearch.org family tree or one of the other family trees. And it's not uncommon for me to see the source say, well, let's do something really simple like the birth date of the person in the record. And the birth date in the source is different than the one that is entered in the detail section of the entry uh, above the source. So what's happened is someone found a birth record. They attach it to the source, to the person, as a support of some information, but then fail to update the information in the record that they've created to reflect the information that they found in the source. Now, if for some other reason that the person did not agree with what was in the record, then there should be some note someplace telling us why when right here is for instance, a birth certificate, and the birth certificate says they were born on one date and the date they have enters is different. So why do we have that difference if there's a birth certificate with a specific date? But really what it comes down to is that with record hints, which are the suggestions given by the various large online family tree programs like Family Search and Ancestry and Find My Past, and there's lots of others, including MyHeritage and now a few other programs that are providing us with record hints. The question is, do we look at them and evaluate them? Now, the second part of this is that we get a record hint that doesn't apply to our person, and we don't evaluate the record hint. We don't read the fine print, in other words, and we add in the record hint as if it was the correct information, even though our ancestors um, obviously is not the person that was mentioned in the record hint. Maybe not so obviously, but the person not record. So this particular rule, read the fine print, means look at what you find and make sure that you use it or you reject it if it isn't applicable, and that you incorporate that information into your database so that the information you have is at least supported by the sources you've added to the record. Okay, so that's kind of the way it works. And in this case, I've got a list here. Now, another one that this is another aspect of the same rule, and that is as you go into a program like the FamilySearch.org family tree or Ancestry or MyHeritage or Find My Past or one of the other programs, and you find that someone has already added a number of sources, it behooves us all to look down through and see if the sources, first of all, apply to the person that they're attached to, and secondly, that the information's been incorporated. So even if I can't get to the people who don't look at the sources when they add them and don't incorporate the information, I would hope that the rest of us would not simply ignore the fact that they may never have looked at the source, and the source may either not be applicable or it may not have been incorporated into the information that we have. And I find this to be extremely common, by the way. This is not something that just happens from every once in a while. It's almost every time I get into doing a lot of editing and arranging and research and using one of the programs for that purpose, I find that especially this especially occurs, of course, not so much that I haven't read my own sources, but in a program like FamilySearch.org where multiple people have access to the data and can make and add choice information and particularly add sources. So that's number 10 in our hit parade of rules. So here's a restatement of read the fine print, and that is make sure the information in the sources is incorporated into the details about the person. Okay, and then make sure that each of the details in the information is supported by a source. And that is kind of an interesting situation also. In one case, for example, I was doing some research back on a family line, and it was one of the lines on the FamilySearch.org family tree that went back, many generations, back into the 15, 14, 1300 type stuff. And the problem is that beginning with the ancestor who was the immigrant in the 1800s, in the mid 1800s, there were no records attached, no source records attached to support any of the information at all of any marriage, birth, or death in listed. And all these individuals had dates and names and spouses and all sorts of things. So what happens is that we need to go out and do the research and support each of those individuals and the facts that are on those from those individuals with records that pertain to the individual. So this sounds like kind of basic stuff, but it's a rule that seems to be not ignored, but perhaps a little bit mislaid in in a lot of cases as we go through the genealogical process. Okay, let's see what we've got in store. Oh, this is rule number 9 in our countdown. The lack of a source renders the information no, this isn't rule number 9. I'm sorry, this should be a rule number 9. By the way, I've just come up with another rule here. I didn't even realize I'd added. Now I have 11 rules here now. Boy, this really messes it up. No, we'll play like this is, like they used to do on the old radio shows, and they would play another musical piece by the same artist, just so you'd know, they didn't have, you could build the suspense. Okay, so this is kind of my building a suspense. It's also the fact that I can't read, but that's just another problem out there. Oh, so we have lack of a source renders the information unreliable. That should just be the basic rule rather than read the fine print, but anyway. So what we say here is that if we don't have any information at all, we shouldn't be putting in dates and making guesses. I think the ultimate on this one, by the way, is in the family trees where you see the surname, like in let's suppose someone got to the end of my surname line going back in time, and so they decide they want to put in the parents. So for the parents of the last person on the line, which probably who the person isn't probably supported by any sources anyway, but the last person out there in that line, and their name is Mr. Tanner, and his wife, of course, is amazingly Mrs. Tanner. And I think that that's kind of the epitome of this making the information unreliable. This is it's interesting that when you get far enough back, and even in English surnames, that you probably can find a point at which the surname no longer existed. And so the assumption that the parents' names were Mr. and Mrs. Tanner probably isn't even warranted as a general rule. Okay, here it is. I'm sorry you were all anticipating number 9 and you ended up with a diversion there. This is number 9, and number 9 in the schedule is there are patterns everywhere. And the thing about genealogy is that it's made up of patterns. There's an old, many years ago, I read a book called Kim, K-I-M, by Rudyard Kipling. And in that book, he was training Kim to be a spy, essentially, the colonel. And basically that, or whoever, the British Army officer. And Kim was taught by playing Kim's game. And Kim's game started with the idea of having a tray or a bowl of various objects, which he would get to look at for a measured period of time, like 5 seconds or 10 seconds, and then was asked to repeat back everything that he saw in the bowl. And that went on and on and on and on. And finally, he became uh, the point where he could walk into a room and remember every detail. Well, this is the concept of what we're looking at here. We're looking at training ourselves to see patterns in the genealogical information that we're faced with. As we get into our research, we need to know that there are patterns, name patterns, for example, not just name patterns within generations, like the father, the first child being named after the husband's father, and et cetera, things like that for different patterns. Those are patterns, but they are not very reliable sometimes patterns. They're not types of patterns they can give us some insight, but they're not conclusive. They don't conclusively do it. The kind of patterns that I'm talking about are a little bit more, um, uh, need to be learned about a little bit more. They're not things that you would see normally immediately. And one of the things that I found as I've spent a great deal of time, part of my life outdoors, is that until you learn the name of something that you see out in nature, out in the wilderness or wherever, it sometimes is invisible. And when you learn the name of something, even if it's something like rabbit bush or creosote or prickly pear or something like that, once you've learned the name of a plant or an animal or a type of rock or even the names of clouds or things like that, then all of a sudden you start to see them everywhere because they just magically seem to be everywhere you look. And that's kind of what happens when you learned about genealogy. When you start to understand that there are patterns and you start looking for the patterns, then you start seeing them. Before that, you may never have realized that there were any patterns. And what do I mean by a family unit forms a pattern? Well, try this for an example. Try going into Google and typing in the names of one of your families, the names of the given names of the members of the family, and then the surname. For example, I can go with my great-grandfather, Henry Tanner, and I can put in his name, Henry, Eliza, his wife, Leroy, one of his children, Rollin, Rollin, one of his other children, and just put in a names like that kind of randomly with the name Tanner and do a Google search, and every time one of the returns in the first half a dozen or so returns will be a reference to that family in Arizona and with the names of the family. The why that is because the names, those particular names form a pattern that is going to be very easy to distinguish from other patterns of other names in other families. The name Rollin, Rollin, is a little bit unusual, and the name Leroy is not as unusual as Rollin, but it is still unusual. And when you put Henry and Eliza with Rollin and Leroy, you end up with, and Tanner, you end up with a unit, a pattern that is discernible, and the computer can go out and find that pattern in a website, and uh, it will be about that family, that particular family. Now, there's limits to the patterns. Some patterns are so general and so, let's call them common or indistinguishable, that you can't really do anything with it. If the father's name is John Smith and they've got kids named George, William, and John, and Joseph or Henry, and then the wife's name is Mary, that is not going to be a pattern that is going to be unique enough to distinguish. But in almost every case, you'll find other patterns, and the patterns don't just extend to the immediate family; they extend over generations, and they extend over um, a multitude of other of people that surround your family, the relatives, near relatives, distant relatives, and also into the community and neighbors and things like that. And one of the patterns that I'm thinking of that you probably don't see too often, and The reason is the same one that I mentioned about the items out there in the wilderness or in nature. And that is until somebody explains to you and gives it a name, then you will never see it. But once you get the idea in your head that there is this pattern, then you start to see it. Let's say for this, for example, the United States Census records are usually taken in a consecutive fashion. In other words, the census enumerators, or census takers, another word for it, went up and down the streets. So the people on a census form are generally neighbors. Maybe not always, but primarily most of the time you can look at it and see that the census, if you go down to the extreme left-hand side of a census record in the United States, beginning in 1850, and you will see basically a street and a number and a house, and they'll have a number, enumeration numbers and things in there. Those numbers then show you that they're doing consecutive. If you were to go do a little more research and get into what are called the enumerator maps, or the maps, or the precinct maps, then the information in the census could be put on a map. You could put down each house and show the names of the people that lived in those houses. And what you would find is that your ancestors were surrounded by a group of neighbors. Now, what happens if all of a sudden you move to a different state and you see the same names in the same pattern? And your person has a very common name, but now you can see that the neighbors, all these people moved together to the new location, or some of them did, or a number of them did. And so seeing all of these people together helps you to recognize the pattern, that this person really was the same one that appeared in the previous pattern. And there's many other examples of that. We could keep going. I could probably do an entire presentation on patterns. But so part of the challenge of genealogical research is discovering, evaluating, and incorporating those patterns into your research so that you recognize that there are patterns, and then you're able to use those patterns to help to identify your ancestors as well as other relatives that are, and acquaintances who are in the area. Another extreme example is that there is somebody's trying to break into our room. No, I don't think so. There is a pattern of people who are in a community, and how we identify people within that community is that we have names, individuals who show up in various records all at the same time. So if you're building a community and you're building the information that's in that community, you can look at things like tax rolls and census records and military records, military roll records, and land and property records, and any kind of community record, and that information all put together with people over a period of time forms a pattern that helps you identify and find your ancestor among a cloud of people that may have similar names or the same name. Okay, so that's just something you need to understand, that there's patterns. These patterns involve names, places, and relationships. So knowing that where the people live in pattern, another pattern that is important is the location pattern. If you're looking for people who seem to have a similar surname, and the question is this form a pattern? Are there people there? Well, if we go back in time far enough, what we're looking for is people who all live in the same place, close together, who we assume to be related. Now, maybe not, depending on the frequency of the surname. But in many cases, the way to identify whether someone is a member of that group, of that family, is to see whether or not their information about where their particular events occurred, for instance, their birth, is consistent with all of the other individuals in that area. Okay, so let me translate that into an example that makes sense. So what do I do? Let's say I have a family in England and I go down the list and I have parents and I have a marriage place, I have birth places and death places for the parents and birth places and maybe death places for the children. And we look at those and they start coming up with the father born in Kent and the mother born in Kent and the first child born in Kent and the second child born in Kent and the third child born in Lancashire and the fourth child born in Kent and the fifth child, so forth, so forth. In other words, what we have is one anomaly, one person who does not fit the pattern. And so there raises a question. And we'll get to that question in a little bit more detail later on in this presentation. But this is important to understand that we look at these patterns and anything outside of the norm of the pattern then becomes questionable. Not that we can reject it outright, but we do have to do, it is an invitation for us to do more research and figure out what the pattern is. So questions are raised when the information we find does not fit the pattern. This is an important thing to understand. The more distant and garish the difference between the pattern. The more it disturbs your pattern, the more serious is the issue, and the more research should be done. And what happens in these cases is that it very, very commonly we find that the anomaly, the person who is not fit the pattern, is not really part of the family because that just doesn't happen that way. So we can also find new information as we extend the pattern. So we need to realize that as we move the pattern either in locations or through time or through relationships, then those patterns should be consistent and persistent so that we could see those people in their context of where they live and how they lived and what they were doing with their lives. Okay, now here's an example. If you look at this, you'll see all sorts of lines going in all sorts of directions. This kind of this example is that the people, as I just mentioned a moment ago, people who are related are grouped together geographically. Now, that's not always the case, especially not in the case in the United States today, with any family in our world of transportation. But as we run the clock backwards and as we go further back in time, we need to combine the concepts of the time and place so that the time it explains the ability of certain people to be mobile. So for example, significance of the date 1830. Well, the 1830 date has significance to a lot of people in a lot of different contexts. But in the context of English research, for example, it's the commonly accepted date for the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So what does that mean in England? It means that before 1830, there were no railroads. Beginning in 1830 was when they began to build railroads. Why is that significant? That's because before 1830, the only method of transportation, other than a boat, if you happen to be on the water, was walking, riding a horse, or riding in a wagon. Those are, buggy or whatever you want to call it, chariot, anything that you have that had wheels and a horse pulling it was the way you could get around. We have to, when we're thinking about different events in our ancestors' lives, when we get back into that kind of a circumstance, then you have to realize how many days and how much time it would take for them to move from one place to another. Okay, so let me give kind of a concrete example here. Let's suppose that your ancestor and another relative, like say someone was in England at the before 1830, and you had two people who were supposedly related and who got married, who lived a great distance apart, say 50 miles. So how long would it take, and how would your one person, let's say that you have a male who goes out and marries his female, So they go out and get married. So you're going to say that, oh, this is the husband and this is the wife. So how do you know how did they get together? That's the question. How long would it take this man who probably didn't have any other means to walk the 50 miles back and forth to where he met the wife? If you show that, in other words, these distances start raising questions. They're not, like I say, they're not conclusive. They don't completely rule out possibilities because people did travel and they did go different places, but the possibility of it happening starts to decrease as we go back in time and we recognize that people were grouped together geographically. Now today you'd have an almost impossible time. Uh, for example, our own family, our immediate family lives all over the United States. Just in any given day, they could be almost in any country in the world. So it's it was quite interesting. So it kind of falls into the time period as being important. So if we can't see a pattern, we have to question the validity of the information. We have to make sure that we're actually seeing patterns, not that we're imagining them. But on the other hand, if we can't see a pattern at all, we have to start questioning the accuracy of the information that we have. Why is this person, who is supposed to be a child born many hundreds of miles away? In my own genealogy that is on the Family Search family tree, which of course everyone has access to, it's not uncommon for someone to add in a child in my great grandfather's family who was born in England, simply because they find a consistent naming pattern. Well, that's just fine, except my great grandparents lived in a little town in northern Arizona called Joseph City till the railroad came through. They never left. And as a matter of fact, as far as I can document, my great grandfather and his wife never left the town the rest of her whole life. And as far as I know, maybe went as far as some of the small surrounding communities, but there's no record of her ever leaving. And there's only a couple of records of my great grandfather going as far as Utah, which is not very far, by the way, from Joseph City as the world goes. So when you see something like that, where a person is put in the family as a child, then that also violates the pattern. Now, this has a lot to do also with the rules that are coming up, so we'll look at those rules. So there are many kinds of patterns: migration patterns, naming patterns, occupational patterns, neighborhood clusters, language patterns, and many others. So all of these come into play as you're doing research, and you need to be aware of them. For example, if your ancestor lived in North Carolina and and his subsequent generations began to move, which direction did they go? So that's an interesting question. I mean, that's part of the migration patterns. And the question you might ask is if you see something that goes counter. So how many of the people in North Carolina, for example, ended up in New Hampshire, as opposed to how many people in North Carolina ended up in Georgia? Those are valid questions to ask, and of course you have to say during what time period, but that helps us. Okay, here we are. Sorry, number 9 was sort of beating it to death, but we're going to get to number 8. Number 8 on our descending survey here of the top 10 is everything in genealogy is connected. And this is also known as the butterfly effect. This is you'll be familiar with this if I actually said it. The butterfly effect. It's that the wing of a butterfly in Asia flapping could disturb the air and ultimately end up creating a hurricane in America. Okay, you think that's ridiculous. It's not. It's basically the way the world works. And you should blame all the butterflies for all the destruction that comes from hurricanes. Um, but this is not, this is something that we really need to understand with genealogy, and that is a minute localized change in a complex system can have large effects elsewhere. And if we don't view genealogy as having as being a complex system, then we're kind of missing the point. We really need to understand that when we get into talking about uh, relationships and the ways that people can be related. So let me just give you an idea. We talk about families. Okay, so what about families where there's an adoption? What about families where there's step parents, where there's been a divorce and a remarriage? What about if there's been a death and a remarriage? What about if there's been um, a guardianship? What about grandparents who are taking care of their grandchildren, or people that have taken in foundlings? Or what about all these different situations? Don't they complicate even our Western European idea of what is a family and how a family operates? And so what we need to know is that we can have one small change in a family that can have a large effect as to how that family is constituted. So we need to view our ancestors in their cultural, social, religious, and political context rather than as a collection of individuals. And as we watch the changes and the interactions between these individuals, then we begin to understand and look at the family as this kind of complex system, almost an organism out there that you can view each of the different people in that and their interactions with each other and how they're related to each other, and that particular type of relationship begins to make, as we go back to the last one, patterns that you can discern and use to help fill out your your family history. Now, maybe you haven't thought about family history on this level, but the problem is thinking in terms of individuals, and it's trying to get away from the idea that we're out there searching for the name of a person somewhere in some record, and that we're going to add him or her into our list of people that we've found and give him a name and give him a date and give him a place, and then we're done. Well, yeah, but by doing that, we basically avoid all of the other relationships and all of the interrelationships that could have happened and did happen as a result of this individual's life. So, and practical effect of this is we need to search beyond the big three record sets. The big three record sets are censuses, vital records, and cemetery records or death records. So what we have, if I look at many of the, I look almost every day at a new set of records that are attached to a different program, such as Family Search or Ancestry or MyHeritage or Find My Past. As I get into these programs, not so much Find My Past, but Ancestry and MyHeritage give you record hints of other individuals who have family trees with your ancestor's name in it. And uh, Family Search family tree is basically a unified family tree, so everybody's got their ancestors in it. So you can see what everybody else has done. And what's happened here as I look at these is that I find out that almost without exception, it seems like all there's there that giving support to this family are one of these kinds of records: censuses, vital records, and cemetery records. And what do you do when you've run out of those three records? Well, that's the big question that comes to most researchers as they're doing research in genealogy, is what do you do next? And the answer is, well, what if you haven't got a census record? What if it's before 1790 in the United States, or it's before 1841 in England or whatever? So what do? Well, we need to extend our research to all of the family members, their friends, and even their associates, so that we can see um, how they relate to each other, and how even one of these individuals can affect the rest of the individuals in this giant pattern of people. And we just hope that everybody fits within that pattern so we can see causes and effects. Um, there's many instances where this comes up and becomes one of the more difficult challenges of genealogy, is particularly if an individual in a family is given is given some kind of questionable status. For example, I have a great great grandfather who was who tradition says was adopted. Well, I find no reference to adoption except in one church record I find where that mentions that he was adopted. And I don't know if that had to do with the church record or someone who said that he was adopted. Well, uh, how did he become part of the family? And this is one of the questions that can become very difficult to resolve absent looking at the greater system of the family. Okay, well that gets us down to Rule 7, and I guess I better speed up because we're kind of getting halfway through our time here, and we haven't even taken breaks for commercials or anything. I mean, we don't even have, all the other stuff that they have on the radio, and I've got only this 1 hour to get down to the top 10, so we better hurry up. So Rule 7 is that water and genealogical information flow downhill. There will be a test at the end of it. No, I'm kidding. But of course, this is kind of thing that you really have to think about. And the reason why these rules exist is because people have ignored this information. And here's the classic example. This is where this comes from. The answer is that this is the most difficult the rules to understand, really. I mean, you're going to have to put on your thinking caps and maybe pull out your dictionaries and do some Google searches and look at Wikipedia to understand this rule. But basically, it goes back to a guy in 1948 who wrote a paper. His name was Claude E. Shannon. And Claude Shannon wrote a paper called A Mathematical Theory of Communication. And in that theory of communication, he applied the concept, it's a mechanical engineering and physics concept of entropy to communication. So what does this have to do with genealogy? Well, genealogy is basically a form of communication. We're looking at documents that were created for different purposes, not for the purpose of having us build a family tree, but for all sorts of different purposes that have nothing at all to do with genealogy or family trees or anything that resembles that. And they were created for all these different reasons. And now we are using them, we're trying to use them, and we're trying to get information in a coherent form out of these random documents that were historically created. Okay, so entropy refers to disorder or uncertainty. And and Shannon entropy, which is a specific kind of entropy having to do with communications or information, ultimately an information theory, provides an absolute limit on the best possible average lengths of lossless encoding or compression of an information source. Okay, what this means is you go long enough and you try to compress things far enough, you lose meaning. So you can no longer get any information out of the system. And how does that apply to genealogy? It's a physical reality that there is a loss of historical data over time. Okay, so genealogical research is basically the process of discovering and evaluating and re-recording those recorded historical events. And then, over time, historical records tend to be lost. So the historical record gradually declines to a state of disorder or entropy. So there's no more information left in the system over a period of time because all of the information that was available at the time the person was living begins to degrade or begins to randomize after the person dies. And once the person is deceased, then The only thing that's preserved is our records that were preserved for many, many, like I mentioned a moment ago, many different reasons, not to preserve the person's life per se, but simply to fulfill some other obligation, military, taxes, land and property, probates, wills, all those kinds of things. Nobody was thinking of, oh, well, we've got to make sure that our descendants here can recreate our family relationships from these documents. Now, there are diaries and journals and other things like that that add to that, to the amount of information available, but over time, those records have a tendency to disappear. And so the further back you go in time, the harder it is to recreate the minutiae, the details of what happened in history. And since genealogy is built on details of the ultimate details, like dates of birth and orders of birth and um, dates of death and marriage and when and who these people were, then that information, as it declines, becomes harder and harder to reconstruct until it disappears altogether. Okay, so when does it disappear altogether? I'm not going to give you an absolute date, but I will tell you what the limit is, and the limit is not back to Adam. It is well into much more recent times. And by the time you get back to those speculative genealogies back in that time, you have well passed the limit of historical entropy. So at some point, all of the information about a person or event disappears from discoverable historical records. Now, if anything's preserved and it just gets less and less until we get down to almost nothing. But the kinds of things we're talking about are the things that were necessary for us to research our family lines, and those records do end, and they do end at any given point in time. I have kind of difficult time when I'm talking to people about their family tree, and I have to tell them that, well, now you're back into 1710 in that part of the world, and there just simply aren't that many more records that you can look at. And they are not happy with that because they seem to think that genealogy is open-ended, that you can just simply keep discovering your ancestors forever. Obviously, if you can go back to Adam, you can keep going back for many thousands of years. That's not necessarily the case. Rule 6, Rule 6. I wish there was some fanfare, boop, 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 something we could play here. And this is really one. If you can't remember this one, then you have trouble remembering any of the rules. This is records move. And why is that important? We have to find out where they went. If we know what a rule is, we need to understand that jurisdictions change. That means that where a record was created may have changed hands for any number of reasons. So a record places as they were at the time, record places as they were at the time of the event. This means that and it should be record places as they were at the times of the event. So that's what happens when you start saying record too many times, then you can't switch over and get to the verbal form of record. So record the places they were at the time of the event. The problem here is that jurisdictions change, records move, and all of these changes affect our ability to find records about an individual. Today was one of those days, and I sat there with an individual who told me that all of their records had been destroyed in their family because of Sherman's march to the sea, and they'd burned down all of the courthouses across the South, and so therefore their family was totally undiscoverable because there were no other records. And my answer to that was, well, that's interesting. So no one had the foresight to move any records out of the way of Sherman's march as they came across the country. They left them all there just so he could burn down the courthouses. Is that what we're going to understand? And further after that fact, nobody had to pay any taxes because nobody knew who owned the land, and the government couldn't levy any taxes. Well, there's all sorts of hypothetical things that happen because of this. But the fact is that jurisdictions do change. Counties were created. You can watch the march of jurisdictional boundary lines across the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast, from 1620 all the way up uh, till the last pioneer crossed the plains and the last person moved to California. And then we're on our way to trying to find the records. Okay, so rule 5, and we have this lovely vegetable here in the garden, and it is a turnip. And the reason we have it is because the rule is that you cannot get blood out of a turnip. Now, it's obvious you can't get blood out of a turnip. That's just, but where does that funny statement come from? Well, it comes from this, and this is the way it's applied to genealogy. We need to have a source for blood connections. Look, we really have to establish the fact that we really are related to these people in some way. We talk about blood connections, we can talk about DNA connections, but DNA connections are a little bit vaguer. What we think by blood connections is the traditional term of being a blood relative, someone who has a direct descendancy line and has related through parentage, biological connections between people. That's the ultimate basis of ours. Although we have other relationships of adoptions and step relationships that I've already mentioned, but basically what we have is this: we need to establish these blood connections. Where does this come up? It comes up that the family tradition is not a source. Now, the reason why, if you're not watching this on the screen, I have to explain, and this is one of the few times that the picture tells you, is what I have a picture of is a throne. And what I'm talking about here is that we can't simply claim royal ancestry unless we can do the genealogy and show how we're related to these people. Okay, it'd be nice that we were all related to some king in England or someplace else on European kings or whatever. You know, I realize this point here. This is an interesting point, and this is the counterpoint to that line. How many of us have been avidly seeking our relationship to some well-known dictator and some infamous person out there in the world? How many of us just think, am I really related to that guy? Oh, how wonderful it would be. Well, okay, you get the point here. We really can't get blood out of a turnip. You just can't not construct royalty out of thin air. You've got to have some kind of connection there. Okay, here we go. Rule 4. Rule 4. There are always more records. Now, some of these might seem familiar to some of you as you listen to this, because I've been saying some of these rules for years and years. But this is a rule that is basically it's aimed at, in a sense, at the person that I just mentioned, that I was talking to today, about the burned counties, about courthouses being burned down. The idea there that there aren't any more records. I mean, I used to say, when people would look at that, say about the courthouse burning down, I would say, well, if I was living in Maricopa County in Arizona at the time, and I would say, well, if the Maricopa County courthouse burned down, there's not one of my records would be lost. So do you know what records were in the courthouse when it was burned down? Has anybody given you a list of the records they lost and which records they didn't lose? Well, you see, that's kind of the answer. And the answer on this one also is that there are so many different kinds of records. There's always more records. Um, People used to come up to me all the time and say, this is the standard statement. I think I've heard this hundreds and hundreds of times. And they would come up to me and say things like this: we are looking for our great-great-grandfather, and we have looked everywhere. We have exhausted every single record we can think of. The answer is there's always more records. And I start asking some very impertinent questions at that time. But basically, the answer is there are always more records. There's always a place to go. And this is the rule for everybody, those people who think they've searched everywhere. They haven't. There's always more records. And there's more things to look, more places to look. And some of the places that I've found records after doing years of searching have just been ordinary. You would think, oh, well, if I just looked there first, I could have saved myself 15 years of time looking for it. But we don't often realize that it's the search that creates the opportunity to find these records. The fact that they appear to be obvious or that we should have known about them immediately is actually the whole issue there. All the records are obvious once you find them, but you've got to look for those records sometimes for a considerable period of time. Understanding also that the main job of being a genealogist is to look for records, not for people. We do look for people, but that's only incidental to our finding the records, not necessarily finding the people themselves. Okay. And this one's rule, by the way, is related to rules 1 and 6, and it's also related to rule 9 and the pattern rule and everything else. I mean, everything's related, and this is the butterfly rule and all that kind of things. Okay. But it's also a rule of hope and faith, by the way. It's a rule that even when you think you've exhausted every source and every possibility in trying to find someone, that is only an illusion, and that you will ultimately be able to find more records. It also, as I mentioned before, applies to those who use the excuse that the courthouse burned down. Well, I'm just going to give an example of that. And the example I'm giving is the Four Courts building in Dublin during the Battle of Dublin back in 1922. And what happened was that that the insurgents at the time, it's hard to tell who was fighting who in Ireland. They all fought each other, but they had stored a huge number of munitions in the records office, conveniently placed next to the dock. And what happened was that they bombarded the building, and all those munitions managed to explode along with the bombs or the shells or whatever that they hit the building with, and it just leveled it. It looked like what it looks like now in California after the fire. And so all the records in that record office were lost. Now it creates a tremendous other problem because there's a psychological problem of finding records in Ireland that says, oh, the records were all lost and we can't find our ancestors. Well, over the past few years, what has happened almost consistently is a new set of records has been introduced almost regularly from Ireland, of records that they're now discovering or emphasizing, or they were there all the time and they're realizing their value, and these other records are helping to to do work in Irish genealogy, even though this vast number of records was destroyed. By the way, the records here were primarily Northern Irish records from Northern Ireland, not from the rest of the Irish island. But remind yourself there's still records in Ireland to search. You can still go searching records even though there was this terrible catastrophe back in 1922. Oh, we had dozens of those. We have one right here in our own United States of America, and that is the National Archives military records that were destroyed in the fire in St. Louis. So, you have lots of these situations, but they do not keep us from finding our ancestors ultimately. They just make it more difficult because there's always more records. We're down to rule 3. We're getting down and we're getting real close, and I'm going to have to talk really fast because I've already talked about these before many times. Every person who ever lived has a unique birth order and a unique set of biological parents. It's important to remember this because in our world of DNA and our world of alternate families and lifestyles and whatever, we still have to remember that basically, no matter how we look at it, we have a biological relationship with two parents, a father and a mother. Not yet have we gotten to the point where that's not possible, and you can start arguing about all sorts of alternate things, but ultimately this is true. And we need to remember that. And the reason why that's important is we need to remember that every single person, every individual is unique, and we have to have that into our minds as we're working. We're down to rule 2, And rule 2 is absence of an obituary or death record does not mean the person is still alive. And so if you can't find the fact that death record, I mean, I've had people come to me and say, "Oh, I've been looking for years to this person. When did he live?" I try to remind myself never to ask when were they born, because that starts another kind of long discussion. But usually what I say is, give me an approximate time he lived. Well, we think he was born in 1720, but we've just never been able to find a death record. And I said, well, do you think he's still alive? No. Well, what does it matter? You know he was there. You know he was alive. You know he died. So what's the deal? Anyway, this really is a rule about not getting fixated on any one particular record. It just may not exist. And so when you get so worried that you're going to spend the rest of your life looking for a marriage record or a death record or birth record, it's just not worth it. You get enough, you got to get on, do some research and get on with the rest of your life. This brings us, oh yeah, and missing records mean nothing more than the records yet to be found, so we'll keep looking anyway. But don't be obsessive about dates. Sometimes they're not recorded. Recently had 3 different dates for birth date for the same individual, absolutely the same day, and they were all given by him. Okay, so, it's just, don't get worried about too much about that. Now, well, what you've all been waiting for is the rule number 1, that fabulous rule that's called when the baby is born, the mother was there. This is the one I have to repeat almost, more than regularly, just almost all the time. It just is, it came up today, by the way, in a matter of speaking. I didn't actually articulate the message, but I had to say that for this person to be part of the family, we had to figure out how the mother got to where the baby was supposed to have been born. And if we can't figure out how the mother got there, then that baby probably wasn't related to the mother. And so this is kind of the ultimate rule. And you would really be, maybe you wouldn't be, but you should be surprised how many times a day, a month, a year I have to say this to people in some form or another. So we're through with our top 10. What's the reasons for these rules? We use common sense when we do genealogical research. We need to avoid obvious inconsistencies and errors. We need to review what we've done as new records are available. All of these things are all wrapped up in these 10 rules of basic rules of genealogical research. The last one is we need to think about what we're doing and see if it makes any sense at all. So thanks for watching. This has been another BYU Family History Library webinar, and we'd encourage you to watch and subscribe to our YouTube.
All right, well, thank you very much, James, for the wonderful presentation. Along with our YouTube channel, we'd also encourage you to follow us on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. We update those with changes to the schedule. Also, whenever videos get posted onto our YouTube channel, there's a notification posted on our social media sites as well, so you can stay up to date with those. And we hope to see you back tomorrow for our next webinar. If you have any feedback for today's presentation, please feel free to write that into our little feedback box down at the bottom of the screen. We always appreciate that, and it helps us to create a better program for you. And so that's always what we're here for. So we hope to see you tomorrow, and have a great rest of your evening.